All right, thank you, Jasmine. Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the delay, but we're all used to tech issues and the securitized culture that cannot be enough logged in situations. So I'm so excited to be chairing this or moderating this panel. It's three great papers. I'm going to introduce the speakers just before they speak, and they're going to speak in the order that is in the program. So the first paper is going to be delivered by Corinne Curtis, who is a second-year PhD student in the Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies Department at York University in Toronto. Their research focuses on craft and activist solidarity work and the role of bureaucracy in advancing administrative violence through passport and visa regulations. So, yeah.
Podium I can see over. I'm not used to that.
You want, I can put it like with full display. So you're good?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would like to begin by disclosing that this project developed out of my time as an employee of the New York Passport Agency, where I was a passport adjudicator from April 2022 until August 2024. When I started in April 2022, the Department of State had just begun rolling out the policies that allowed gender marker self-certification and the X-gender marker option on passports. This research was inspired by resulting situations that I experienced, witnessed, or were communicated to me while I worked in passport services. I also want to acknowledge that the current administration's violence against trans communities and individuals using bureaucracy, including the passport application process, is a pressing concern that I have yet to address in this research. The title of this paper actually refers to the section of the Foreign Affairs Manual that previously detailed rules regarding gender markers on passports that has been unavailable and listed as unassigned since 2025 due to the current administration's anti-trans crusade. This paper examines the role bureaucratic administration and homo-nationalist discourses play in advancing the state's biopolitical regime and perpetuation of administrative violence. I argue that the discursive formulations in the Zim versus Blinken case and the resulting changes to U.S. passport policy on gender markers represent a continuation of normative frameworks of queerness that presume whiteness as default. In doing so, the bureaucratic process ignores the interconnected sites of power that continue to impact the most marginalized members of the trans community. Utilizing Jasbir Porah's definition of homo-nationalism as, quote, a structuring force of neoliberal subject formation, this presentation looks specifically to the Zim case and policies regarding gender markers on passports as sites of citizen subject formation and perpetuation of administrative violence. The neoliberal model that shapes our world has centered rights as the dominant framework for social change, focusing on inclusion within existing systems that ignores intersectional analysis and substantive change to unequal frameworks. Part of this model includes the role of homo-nationalism in producing homonormative legal inclusion, like marriage equality, that predominantly favors white middle-class queers and resists structural change centered on the needs of marginalized people. As a result, legal cases bring about legislative and policy changes that incorporate groups further into bureaucratic surveillance systems that make life more difficult for those who are still unable to access these benefits. In 2017, Lambda Legal filed suit with the U.S. District Court for Colorado on behalf of Dana Zim, after Zim had been denied a passport due to their request for an X-gender mark. They argued Zim is intersex, and therefore a binary gender/sex marker did not accurately reflect their situation. And an X marker, which had been adopted by other countries and the International Civil Aviation Organization, would be more suitable. The complaint was filed based on the argument that the Department of State's previous policy restricting passport holders to male or female gender markers violated the Administrative Procedure Act and the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The complaint argued that the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause also protects each person's fundamental liberty to individual dignity and autonomy, including the right to define and express one's own identity, to define one's own concept of existence, and to make intimate decisions concerning marriage, procreation, and family life, all without undue government interference." End quote. Placing trans and intersex identities within this framework advances narratives of progress and modernity that are used to dehumanize other populations and justify violence against them. In centering the idea that not having a certain gender marker is a violation of the right to define and express one's own identity, instead of arguing that gender markers on identification are unnecessary and invasive, a passport has a photo after all, the Zim case perpetuates surveillance systems that police individuals based on gender. Therefore, marginalized trans folks, such as those who cannot afford passports or are undocumented, are increasingly beholden to the system which requires IDs with correct gender markers in the first place. Hypothetically, the inclusion of X gender markers and the ability to self-certify one's gender on a passport circumvents the administrative violence of inconsistent access to identification due to differing state regulations. In 2021, following the Zim case, passport applicants were able to begin self-certifying gender marker changes without need for medical or other documentation. In April 2022, the Department of State began allowing applicants to select an X gender marker, in addition to male and female, with X being defined as unspecified or another gender identity. This definition created a certain level of ambiguity that granted individuals the ability to circumvent becoming entirely intelligible to the government's surveillance structure produced by the border and national security apparatus. In reality, the presumptions made by the policy and the selective nature of the regulation's text fails to consider the ways subjection and power operate in the lives of trans individuals. And only making changes to policies regarding gender marker designation, the passport process upheld a normative construction of citizenship that prioritizes the inclusion of the white queer subject to the exclusion of other minority applicants. Looking at the implementation of passport regulations on gender markers exposes how this single-sided change does not address existing inequalities within the passport application process that subject marginalized people to increased scrutiny and difficulties in navigating bureaucracy. So the FAM, or the Foreign Affairs Manual, is a series of bureaucratic procedures that provide guidance and regulations for civil service and foreign service employees. The FAM is published online and the public has access to most unclassified materials, with classified or sensitive information being labeled as unavailable. Up until January 20th, 2025, 8 FAM 403.3 was labeled with the title Gender Designation and available to the public as it dealt with personally identifiable information. The text of that section stated that A, applicants for a U.S. passport and/or CRIPA who request a different gender than that listed in the sex field on their previous passport, other evidence of citizenship, or evidence of identity may self-designate their gender marker on the application. B, there is no documentation required of an applicant to request a change to the gender marker. Medical certification is not required. Parents of minor applicants may select the requested gender marker on the minor's behalf. However, the guidance continues to note that if there is a discrepancy between the gender selected on the passport application and the applicant's documentation, that the adjudicator should verify the intended gender marker with the applicant. So while a trans individual is theoretically allowed to self-certify without documentation, the text of 8 FAM 403.3 implies that discrepancies between ID, etc., and the selected gender marker on an application are indicative of an error that needs to be verified before processing, adding delays and microaggressions to the process of applying for a passport by trans individuals. Additionally, while the text was updated as of April 5th, 2023, to allow applicants to use a DS-82 U.S. passport renewal application for eligible individuals, or a DS-5504 application for a U.S. passport for eligible individuals, correction, name change to passport issued 1 year ago or less, and limited passport placement. form for gender changes, initially the process of changing a gender marker required applicants to continue to use Form DS-11, application for a U.S. passport. For a DS-11 form to be valid, it must be executed by an authorized acceptance agent, usually an employee of a USPS facility, local library, or county government. This execution comes with an additional fee of $35 on top of the $130 cost of the passport book. Additionally, while Department of State employees have access to an optional LGBTQ awareness training, contract staff at passport agencies and acceptance agents do not get trained on LGBTQ issues. During my tenure at the New York Passport Agency, I know of at least 2 incidences of transphobic harassment towards applicants by contract staff who accepted applications, and 1 incident with a Postal Service employee requiring an applicant to provide medical documentation of their transition. Initial review of Reddit posts detailing experiences of trans passport applicants indicate that not being informed of the need to use a DS-11 or acceptance agents refusing to accept gender marker changes on applications without medical documentation were common issues for trans applicants. This is representative of an institutional structure that sees policy changes as a panacea without acknowledging the systemic bias inherent within the bureaucratic apparatus. Here, trans applicants become responsible for an increased burden of documentation and face hostile encounters and harassment from acceptance agents and passport employees. Other barriers to access during this period included that until fall 2023, the only passport agency that was capable of printing passports with X gender markers was the Western Passport Center in Tucson, Arizona. Any X gender markers received during this period via mail or in person had to be forwarded to WPC, adding additional processing time. And if anyone remembers the 2023 passport backlog, it caused a lot of problems. Individuals who needed emergency passports at other agencies were forced to obtain passports with binary gender markers and then use the DS-5504 to replace them at no cost if under 1 year afterwards. Finally, applicants faced processing delays in other areas. 8 FAM 403.1-4 notes that amended birth certificates are only acceptable evidence of a name change when the applicant's ID and all other evidence, e.g. previous passport records, are in the same name, end quote, and that an amended birth certificate is not sufficient by itself to document a material name change unless provided for by law. If the applicant only submits the amended birth certificate, you must request acceptable evidence of the material name change, e.g. a court order, end quote. That means that trans individuals with passports in their assigned gender at birth needed to provide additional documentation to comply with name change policies, even though there were other factors providing rationale for the name change, namely gender transition. In some cases, the amended birth certificate could be compared to the passport record to provide existing evidence of the change. This increases processing times and costs for trans applicants who are already subject to greater economic inequality and whose safety is more dependent on correct documentation to navigate hostile infrastructure at state and local levels in housing, policy, policing, welfare, and other systems. Further research will involve an examination of the experience of applicants who self-certified their gender markers or changed their markers to X, as well as requesting internal consular affairs documents regarding the implementation of gender markers and self-certification through a FOIA request. Application. Looking to applicant interactions with the bureaucratic apparatus allows further interrogation into barriers to access, such as possible delays, owing to additional documentation being needed, and even exclusion from eligibility due to the repercussions of having convictions from engaging in sex work. Moving forward, research on this topic will have to reconfigure the scope to include the anti-trans violence and eroding of neoliberal Western norms of inclusion and equality currently being undertaken by federal and state governments. Executive Order 14168, the Supreme Court decision in the Orr v. Trump case, and the current administration's policy of requiring transgender visa applicants to disclose their assigned sex at birth show the tenuous security provided by homo-nationalist inclusion. And revoking the ability to have federal identification documents with correct gender markers, the administration increases the risk of violence to transgender individuals in particular green card holders, who are also at risk to the escalation of violence by ICE, and limits the potential for trans citizens to vote should the passage of other legislation like the SAVE. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, our next speaker is Noelle Derksen. They them Noelle currently serves as the Early Career Research and Program Assistant in the Research and Academic Program at the Clark Art Institute. They hold an MA in Contemporary Art History and are preparing for future doctoral study. So welcome. Welcome here.
Can I make it?
Yeah, do you want me to make it? full
Yeah.
screen? Yeah.
But
And you can use this.
perfect. Okay. Hey everyone. First, I just want to say thank you so much to my co-panelists and the organizers, facilitators. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Noelle, and today I'm going to be talking about biohacking gender. And this is very much a work in progress. So if anyone has suggestions or thoughts, please, talk to me at the end. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys because I recently spoke about this to a room of art historians. And so now being here, it's like I don't have to explain what HRT means. So it's exciting. Okay. So on November 17th, 2019 in Paris, Paul B. Preciado delivered his address, Can the Monster Speak, before 3,500 psychoanalysts. Asserting a position of epistemological insubordination to the binary heterocentric regime, Preciado spoke as the gender deviant, the disordered object, the trans monster, and yet he seized the positionality of the knowledge producer. In this seizure, a host of disciplinary institutions, namely psychoanalysis, biomedicine, technoscience, and global systems of knowledge production, were troubled. In conjunction with Preciado, my project aims to think through what it means when gender diverse artists, hackers, community scientists, and other dissident subjects take endocrinology and biochemistry into their own hands, seizing technologies of the self and engaging in practices of biohacking gender. Biohacking is a method of manipulating biology by using molecular, medical, or technological tools, and biohacking gender more specifically refers to gender diverse people engaging in various kinds of transition outside of the psychomedical apparatus and the state. This often takes shape as DIY HRT, whereby individuals ingest non-prescribed hormones without the oversight of a medical provider. The praxis of biohacking gender, grounded in radical relationality, operates simultaneously as a material practice, facilitating DIY HRT within queer networks of care, and as a speculative conceptual strategy, through which artists engage it both as method and subject to interrogate and reimagine body sovereignty. In doing so, not only is the pharmacopornographic regime theorized by Preciado critiqued with its colonial entanglements and capitalist medical apparatus, but also multivalent forms of resistance are mobilized that invent and sustain alternative sites for the radical trans imaginary to emerge across both lived and aesthetic domains. The monster can certainly speak, and the monster can hack. In 2008, I'm sure we're all aware of, Preciado's seminal Testo Junkie was released, circulating an autotheoretical dissection of his addiction to non-prescribed Testogel, a gelatinous technology of great radical potential. And these are some schematic drawings from Testo Junkie. In his diagnosis, our post-Fordist economy is best understood as the pharmacopornographic era, an epoch sustained by the production and commodification of subjectivities. In this biopolitical regime, bodily control is microprosthetic, power is enacted molecularly. With the creation of synthetic hormones and other biochemical prostheses, gender has become literally encapsulated and commercialized, retroactively circumscribing masculinity and femininity in relation to the molecule with which they are treated. Procurable biotechnologies of the self do not diverge, but bureaucratic administrative systems preside over them, managing access as predicated on class, race, gender, sexuality, and ability. While HRT is often gatekept from trans folks in the highly conditional arena of trans medicine, HRT often flows freely when it serves cis heteropatriarchal productivity, such as instances of treating menopause symptoms, low T syndrome, and so on. These are some ads that I found. When the medical apparatus does indeed greenlight a transition, it is best understood within a heterodyadic system of oppositions, enacting a unidirectional conversion to normalize difference to bring order to supposed biological disorder. In this antagonistic architecture of either ors, non-binary or genderqueer individuals whose incorrect desires do not align with those of a transsexual transition are rendered illegible and ontologically disrupt the medical apparatus and even trans medicine more acutely. The pharmacopornographic regime and its inaccessible, inequitable, and violent medical system then produced the conditions for biohacking gender to emerge. So, as I'm sure we're all quite aware of here, the oppression of gender diverse people is unmistakably capitalist. Gender normativity being the congruence of phenotype, behavior, and desire within a cis heteronormative framework is synonymous with health, productivity, and value. Because the gender binary underpins capitalist organization, shaping labor, social life, and the nuclear family, DIY HRT networks function as collective resistance to both the pharmacopornographic regime and capitalism itself. It functions as a class practice of seizing the production of gender from bureaucratic regulation. Information and support regarding DIY is circulated through both in-person and virtual networks, often taking shape as zines, online forums, open source manuals, live workshops, support groups, and more. As a form of tactical hacking, a sense of illegality is central to the praxis, producing biohackers who operate through underground extra-institutional webs, thereby bypassing bureaucratic systems of medical regulation. These networks are typically organized as horizontal, non-hierarchical, and collaborative. And although we call it DIY HRT, the practice is firmly grounded in a DIWO, or do it with others ethos. Queer biohacking centers a post-humanist, communalist ethics, rejecting anthropocentrism and individualistic thinking, and embraces the body as an assemblage, as slippery, as entangled with human and non-human agents. Embodiment is a becoming, and undoneness identities are permanently partial. Queer biohacking communities develop the expertise that often outpaces clinical providers and endocrinological research, and in receiving information on HRT from these networks, there's a sense of intimacy and sensitivity to the complexity of transition that's often impossible to match in the clinic. There's room for self-experimentation, uncertainty, and affective contradiction. These rhizomatic undercommons generate counter-archives, alternative kinship structures beyond the nuclear family, and perhaps enact a sense of prefigurative politics. When transness is apprehended exclusively through a medicalized network, confined to the clinical, the sterilized, the erotic dimensions of HRT are systematically effaced. By contrast, within DIY practices, and as Preciado articulates through the notion of the spiritual force of T, HRT can be reconfigured as an erotics of self-experimentation wherein pleasure, desire, and ritual coalesce in the material act of ingestion. And here we can inaugurate alternative epistemologies and modes of embodiment that foreground the erotic, the spiritual, and the ritualistic. Biohacking gender is also situated within larger histories of queer and feminist lay expertise, from AIDS activism to DIY gynecology. Even reaching to Silvia Federici's work, the relatively recent professionalization of medicine can be understood as the attempted eradication of lower class knowledges and the reinforcement of hegemonic knowledge of the expert, something which is indispensable to the insertion of capitalism globally. Endocrinology is founded on histories of extractivism, exploitation, and violence against human and non-human minoritarian subjects. During the golden age of steroid chemistry in the mid-20th century, hormones were extracted from bull testicles, pig ovaries, pregnant mares, gonads taken from imprisoned individuals, the urine of pregnant people, and more. Infamously, in the 1950s, the pill trials took place in Puerto Rico, unethically subjecting poor non-white women to contraceptive experimentation and medical surveillance. Lacking informed consent and undoubtedly justified by eugenic logics, the exploitative endeavor led to the production of the first commercial contraceptive pill. Contemporaneously, the US government and pharma companies undertook extractivist expeditions across Africa, South and Central America, and Mexico to identify plant species suitable for the manufacturing of steroid hormones. The history of endocrinology is likewise intertwined with capitalist imperatives, wherein hormonal regulation has been explicitly framed as a means of optimizing productivity and stabilizing social order. Mid-20th century medical discourse promoted the morale-boosting and labor-enhancing effects of maintaining hormonally normative bodies. And gynecologist William Masters advocated for therapeutic estrogen use in postmenopausal women, suggesting, quote, a major contribution will have been made not only to the treated individuals, but to the economy and potential manpower supply of our country, end quote. What's more is that hormones themselves have been colonized in the pharmacopornographic era. The development of steroid hormone production catalyzed a pivotal transformation in intellectual property law, enabling the patenting of substances once regarded as natural, rendering molecular biocodes subject to ownership, monopoly, and restriction. Hormones can be understood as colonial artifacts, and while Preciado and others argue that biohacking gender functions as a decolonial reappropriation of bodily technologies, endocrinology remains deeply implicated in ongoing neocolonial regimes of control. Consequently, such practices are entangled with these histories of violence, and any anti-colonial form of biohacking must explicitly acknowledge and reckon with them. Beyond these colonial and capitalist entanglements, conceptions of hormones are also shaped by fallacious ideals of purity and the natural. Discourses of econormativity and anti-toxicity that frame HRT as unnatural rely on a false ideal of bodily purity, ignoring that we are all always already shaped endocrinologically by pervasive environmental contaminants and chemical exposures. This reveals a central paradox that the same capitalist structures that materially clear bodies through releasing endocrine disrupting chemicals into the environment subsequently pathologize those very deviations. The rise of the internet alongside black market pharma networks and the emergence of publicly accessible archives of endocrinological knowledge has been integral in wresting control of the hormonal economy from institutions. However, the displacement of bureaucratic authority by market logics does not in itself constitute a substantive emancipatory victory. While the largely clandestine practice of DIY marks an imperative site of resistance, it remains insufficient on its own, necessitating the development of more strategies for organizing and noncompliance, as well as broader efforts to cultivate public awareness and solidarity. And in this regard, I believe that the arts emerge as a critical arena for such intervention. Preciado describes that the hormone is not an end in itself, but an ally in the task of inventing an elsewhere. These elsewheres, both material and immaterial, encompass present-day manifestations and futures of justice to come. The radical transimaginary rejects assimilationist, state-centered frameworks in favor of creating alternative worlds grounded in the traditions of the oppressed. And here I'm drawing on T.J. Demos's radical futurisms. This here is a chart by the artist Mary Magic, who I'll talk about more in a moment. A critical aspect of my project is the role of the parasitic trans artist invading the institution to contaminate it and its visitors with their gender excess. Because institutions invested in profit and power are unlikely to pursue such lines of inquiry as democratizing medical knowledge, artists and independent researchers must take up this work, advancing experimental approaches that unsettle dominant epistemologies. The artistic practices I'm interested in are not merely illustrative, but methodological, with artists intervening in endocrinology and seizing positionalities of knowledge producers. Again, I want to see the monster hack. My larger research project engages with artists like Mary Magic or Ryan Hammond, who are doing incredible work in their respective projects, open source estrogen and open source gender codes. They aim to subvert the medical apparatus and big science by developing protocols to produce hormones at home and convene workshops to make such scientific processes accessible. This very material work is, of course, crucial and on the nose of everything I've discussed thus far. But with this in mind, I'd like to take this opportunity to present some work that is a bit more speculative and affective and quite literally atmospheric, but still methodological and grounded in hormonal materiality. Hormonal Fog is a collaboration between artists Candice Lynn and P Staff, in which they fittingly hack a commercial fog machine, rigging it up with a tincture of herbs that are natural anti-androgens. Vaporized and dispersed into the gallery space, the anti-androgens circulate the air freely, penetrating and contaminating the institution, gendering the air. Visitors are polluted, corporally infiltrated, their genders disrupted. Hormones are transverse substances produced in all bodies independent of gender, and they function in a decentralized manner. Throughout this research, decentralization has emerged more and more as a unifying principle and an organizational structure. A rejection of paternalistic authority, concentrated power, identity politics. As the hormonal fog circulates the air through the ether, a diffuse transness, decentralized and inextinguishable, proliferates. To some, it's a toxic embrace, a rejection of the so-called purification machine of capitalism and its medical apparatus. Ungovernable, gender diversity is reconstituted less as identity and more as desire and process. Time-space is always already queer, polluted, contaminated, undone. For those still subscribing to the binary regime, to conceptions of anti-toxicity, to determinism, to the chimera of the hermetic body, may the hormonal fog be ingested and digested, making plain the artifice of the too long-standing architectures of the hegemony. And here is just another sort of larger scale iteration of their collaborative project where they have the hormonal fog machines going off as well. So Celia Roberts posits the concept of provocation enables a reconceptualization of hormonal enactments, opening spaces for forms of relationality that exceed deterministic frameworks. Analogously, I believe that artistic practices can function as such, as provocations, as generative forces that exceed determinism, troubling hegemonic structures while enabling alternative modes of being, knowing, and world building that foreground impurity, mutability, and complexity. My project is not an uncritical endorsement of unsupervised self-medication, but rather it works towards destigmatizing DIY practices, demystifying biomedicine, and contesting the late capitalist governance of embodiment and subjectivity, thereby hopefully opening space for trans-imaginaries and iterative strategies of bioresistance. To some, the notion of DIY transition may seem aggressive or utopian or ridiculous. I mean, I had to explain this to my parents who live in Pennsylvania, so I get it. But again, I'd like this work to act as a provocation. And in closing, I just wanted to leave you with a quote from Kim Tallbear. Tallbear confers that in our current moment, we are being met with an emerging form of whiteness, not in reference to phenotype or European ancestry, but as a modality of power in which the authority of scientific rationality confers legitimacy on some while rendering others as irrational or uncivilized, thereby foreclosing critiques of power and suppressing challenges to colonial paradigms.
Thank you. And our final speaker today is Pedro Barrios, who is a PhD candidate at Complutense University of Madrid in Spain. He focuses on transmasculinity and transfatherhood in South America and how digital technology is a tool for trans resistance.
You don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh,
This is my flat.
oh there it is. Okay, awesome.
I think it's really final PDF.
This one?
Yeah.
Slide it over.
Okay.
Mhm.
She here. It's just a little bit funny. Okay. Yeah. You can like scroll. Or did you want it full screen?
Yeah.
You want the screen?
Yeah.
Let me see. I've never used Where is
So
it?
the plus minus, yeah, right there.
There?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, is that good?
Okay,
Okay. Thank you.
so yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Because I only be here in New York only for this conference, and Sunday afternoon I go back to Spain. So it's only 2 days here. So yeah, that I'm very nervous to be here, and I have to be here. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for my co-panels, Professor Currah. That is a pleasure to be here with you, and for all of you. So this is my research, is part of my PhD dissertation that's focused on transmasculinity and transfatherhood in South America and Spain, and the use of digital resources and digital technology in order to fight back, yeah, anti-trans hate violence. I live in South America for 4 years, so I work on human rights and sexual and diversity human rights. So, for example, in Bolivia, I know all the trans mothers that are committed there, and with the facility of the state. Okay, this is my background. So this is the reason. So
I think you could just like scroll.
really? Yeah. Okay. The key argument of my research is that I argue that transmasculine activism in Brazil to rethink is an example to rethink gender identity, masculinities, and technology as social and relational infrastructures. So for me, transmasculine hacker practices in Brazil help us to understand masculinities constructed through digital technologies and technopolities, like digital platforms, also as dual spaces, that they are sites of anti-trans hate, but also are spaces of resistance. And hacking for trans hacker in Brazil is beyond the technical thing. It's like practices that reveal a structure of power and exploitation. And the current technology is colonial, racist, is normative, and class. This is the character contemporary digital technology. So, transmasculine people, this is more or less the context. Transmasculine people and transmasculine hackers in Brazil and are engaged with indigenous people and African people, well, the center of African people, because they think that now modern colonialism is beyond the ancient colonialism, because now in Brazil they fight together against digital colonialism, but also against data centers. Okay, and they fight for the autonomy of the territories, that quilombos. Okay, because some of them of transmasculine hackers belongs to these communities. So you see here that the context in Brazil that unify all these struggles. Okay, normally militants of free software, also they are militants in organization that they try to recover their memories, ancestral memories, okay, and to decolonize technology, and also counter-colonize, okay? Because in Brazil, they think that decolonize is a thing that is in the box of the colony, but counter-colonizing is an idea that of Black African philosopher of Brazil, Antonio Negro Bispos, that he says that in Brazil, people, indigenous and African people, has to think outside of the colony, so before the colony. So this is more or less, for example, this is very important, that what happens in the periphery is called gambayara. It's in Portuguese, that is improvised solution, but what happens in Silicon Valley is called innovation. So this is another form of colonialism, digital colonialism and they think that the global north also extracts their data and all the minerals that they have. This is the reason that they unify the struggle. Okay. So some data of Brazil, and this is the reason that I choose Brazil, because I think it's an example, a country that use digital technology a lot. So 134 million Instagrammers, okay, users. But on the other side, they suffer a lot about trans violence. Okay, I think it's the one is the first country in the world with trans murders, and at the same time is the country with more trans pornography consumed. So that is, and this is especially important that 88 of victims are racialized. Okay, it's black or brown. In Portuguese, brown is pardo. Okay, and 90% is transgender women. This is like a contest to have in order to understand the struggle that transmasculine hackers are doing in Brazil. So, and this is important data also, that digital inequality in Brazil is strongly structured by class. Okay, class precarity, restricted technology access. In my digital ethnography, I interview dozens of trans masculine hackers, and all of them live in the periphery. Okay, when you live in the periphery in Brazil, the big companies of technology of Brazil, they don't go there. So what does it mean? That they have to use their own modem, okay, their own technology, in order to access technology. But they normally have a regular market job. So they have this situation that they don't have access to technology, and they don't have an economy in these peripheral territories. So they have to unify in organization in order to have also employees, okay, and also access to technology. Like, for example, we have here like a structural racism, algorithm discrimination, because transmasculine hackers is a response to this. Also to the access to technology, structured by class, and also to algorithm discrimination, because for example, 72 of favela residents are black or brown. Okay, periphery. So with that territorial inequality in Brazil is also racial. So, and transphobia, expulsion from formal economy. Transphobia expels people from employment, healthcare, and education, producing precarity that compounds class and racial exclusion. So we see here that all these layers that combine in the same struggle. Okay, that the access to internet, to access to technology, the algorithm discrimination, and the exclusion from formal economy. So, in this situation, what that the trans masculine hackers do? So, But they think that, for example, that to be hacker is not only to know a lot about technology or have a lot of knowledge about digital issues. Is more than that. Because theoretically, hackers practice reveal that gender norms operate like codes, okay, embedded in society. This code regulates bodies and identities. They can also be hacked and reprogrammed. So for transmasculine hackers, they think that technology has to be social because they are discriminating. And not only transmasculine people, that indigenous people and African people. So they have this idea that technology has to be communitarian. So for them, to be a hacker is the way to have an access for all over the world, for all over the diversity that they have in Brazil. So because they think that now technology is only for white men that are in the hacker spaces in Sao Paulo and other cities, big cities, but they don't belong to them. So they begin to build and construct other hacker spaces with technology that includes diversity, that includes social justice. For them, technology has to be social technology. So, like hacking and trust experience follow similar paths, okay? Both involve understanding and transforming a structure of power, digital, physical, and linguistic, in order to create more just conditions of life, especially for those historically marginalized. So, in their words, they think that to be a hacker is to fight the power that's define the world. Okay, doesn't mean maybe the language that we have to use, the body that they say that we have to have, the gender that they say that we have to be. Okay, all of this that the colonialism and the global north say, okay, you have to be like that. They say, okay, we don't give a fuck about that, and we are going to do our own technology. Okay. And for example, this is quite interesting because hacker spaces, all the spaces in Brazil, now is more diversity. But before, only male, white male, and also there is hacker spaces in Brazil that support far rights, Bolsonaro, and they canvassing for them. So this is strange. So for white and they are hacker spaces that are moving from white individualistic hackers to plurality, right? It's kind of epistemology. Openings in the Brazilian hacker genealogy. Feminist, black, indigenous, queer, and trans collective reshape the very meaning of hacker. So, in my digital ethnography, which kind of transmasculine hacking practices I discover an amazing, rich ecosystem of hacking practices. And there is a huge community fighting for social justice and for the territories of Brazil. And for example, bodily hacking, there is a counter-colonial identity that is boiceta. Boiceta is a word that mixes boy and buceta. Buceta in Portuguese means vagina. Okay, so this is very interesting because this word search in the rapper scenario in Sao Paulo, in the periphery, in the 90s, okay, from a transmasculine guy that with indigenous background, that they don't feel that he doesn't feel okay with the term trans man, okay, because he thinks that was was a colonial term, so he decided to embed this boiceta term that is more, they are people that consider themselves like transmasculine people, but in a queer manner, without and with the thing that they have this word in order to decolonize their bodies, okay, and don't use the word of the global north. So, and this is very interesting because 3 or 4 months ago, a rapper called Jupiter, okay, you can search in YouTube, in a podcast, Entre Amigas, Between Friends, this is the name of the podcast. He declared himself a boyzeta, and after this episode, a lot of anti-trans hate in the social networks. Okay. We have another linguistic hacking. Okay, Payuba language. Payuba is a language that trans people and travestis people during dictatorship in the 70s in Brazil, they invented this language in order to passing messages, avoid the police, avoid the military. So Payuba now they use trans people and transmasculine people, they use this language, okay, also in Brazil, and they have a university with Payuba language, okay. This is kind of a linguistic technology, also like to change the language that is imposed in the colony, okay. And we have pedagogical hacking that Brava is a training digital platform specialized in colonialism, transmasculine, and and trans women rights. I'm a user of Brava, and I teach with I scholar with them to know about all the terms that I don't know. So I'm a Spanish language speaker, but they are in Portuguese, but more or less I understand. And also they have infrastructural hacking, and they have this Payubasap. This is a chatbot that is in Pernambuco, it's in the periphery of Brazil, for example, that has a lot of anti-trans violence. So if you are trans people in Pernambuco, you can use WhatsApp with the chatbot and like, okay, I have violence in this spot of the city, and with this chatbot, they call the police or they call the social services, another thing. And you have Radar Social. This is a technology platform that was developed because of the Boiseta affair in the podcast, okay? And Radar Social use artificial intelligence to know all the anti-hate discourse that is a free software technology used in they are in the social networks, okay. And this is very interesting because all of these are linked with this organization. Love Coco is our organization that developed the Yaruba culture, that is kind of religion there in African origin, and Rede de Mocambos and Baubaxia. So like you have these 4 hackings, but they are linked with these ancestral territorial networks. Okay, this I said before, that is the same struggle. So a lot of militants of this, they also live in these ancestral territories. Okay, I'm going to. This is some of the things that you can see in the Instagram. Okay, you have this Payuba, Tecnología Ancestral, you have Payuba Zap and Boiseta. Okay, it's only to show you. Okay, this is rather social technology, and they use this free software. Okay, and this is Brava. This is the platform that you use to have courses that it's very good, and I use a lot. So, okay, this is this is a free software network. This is Baobab. Baobab is a tree, a holy tree in Africa. So they mix Baobab and Galaxia. Okay, they Baobaxia. Okay, because they have this free software network in order to have digital sovereignty and digital autonomy to have all their memories because they don't believe in the global north technology. Okay, they have their own technology, and this is like all the system that they have. Okay, and this is my last. Okay, I asked a lot of transmasculine hackers for the future of trans technology, and they told me that they are tired of hacking things. They are tired of being hackers. They don't want to be hackers. So they one told me that maybe I'm not an expert of that, but maybe quantum computing is a good way to have a trans horizon because classical computing operates in binary 0 or 1. Quantum computing holds multiple simultaneous state superposition, like different identity of genders. So trans and non-binary lives are not exception to be corrected, but living anticipation of other technological futures. So they use trans cosmology that they emerge from a trans thinking. So they are tired of use technology of other people. They want to use their own technologies. This is the reason that trans thinking, that they have to develop trans technology, they have to develop for trans people. Okay. And they use counter-colonial genealogies, okay, in order to have indigenous knowledge, ancestral memory platforms, and technopolitical resistance. Trans people, this I think is quite important that they are not passive, they are active actors, okay? Not vulnerable user who design, controls, and direct technologies determines whether futures are just plural and non-binary. So more or less, these are the conclusion that my research that transmasculine hacking is not merely gender resistant, it is a material class response to precarity, social inequality, and digital colonialism in the global south. Hacking is not only a technical practice, it is political, bodily, linguistic, and communitarian. Transmasculine hacking expands the very concept of hacktivist practice. Class precarity, structural racism, and transphobia intersect to produce both exclusion and creative resistance. Community respond by building their own infrastructures, shifting trans people from vulnerable users to active technology creators. And the last, gender operates as proprietary software. Trans transition equals epistemic hacking. So counter-colonial masculinity equal free software reprogramming of his heteropatriarchal code. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, if I can have the panelists come up to the front and to the table. And this panel started 10 minutes late because of our technological logging on snafu. So we might just go over a few minutes. So, but if we can have questions for the panelists, and if we can as an audience collectively sort of self-regulate in the distribution of questions, that would be great. All right. So I'm not sure that we can read. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories?
Yes. I was wondering if you could speak more to the construction of either subverting the neoliberal science. I mean, I know you had this. You had the panel discussing it, but
Yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of the artists and researchers and are interested in acknowledging the situatedness of the neoliberal science and sort of trying to bring to light the situatedness of these systems, and then through their own sort of DIY practices come up with resistant forms of that. I think one thing that I need to think about more, I was talking about this recently with a colleague, is like the tension between like, you know, supporting these forms of like citizen science and lay expertise, but then also we're in a contemporary climate where like truth and fact and like scientific research is being sort of debated and considered like, you know, fact is being questioned. So it's like there's an interesting tension there between like how you acknowledge some forms of like scientific expertise, but then also support, the citizen scientists. I don't know, it's something I need to think about more.
Thank you. Yeah, the back.
Thank you so much for a great panel. Question for Pedro. Fascinating research that you're doing. I was wondering about training. I was wondering about actual training in terms of where and how do the kind of technical training come about within these communities that
The hackers
Correct.
were there.
how do they get trained? How do they know what to do technologically? How does that?
Yeah, because some of them go to training courses, and some of them they work in technology area, okay, but they decide to go to the territories to work. Okay, they have this training like traditional training of technology, okay, but they use this in the peripheries, okay, but some of them they don't know anything about that, and they go to another organization, big organization, in order to to get some of this training. So we have both. We have both like educated people that go to university, but they live in the peripheries, okay? But for example, people from Quilombos, okay, that are and the Mocambos that are territories, ancestral territories, they teach themselves, okay? One person teach other, okay? Like this quite communitarian thing in Brazil, and the ancestral territories, they have their own jurisdiction in the constitution of Brazil. So they have this autonomy ideology that they have to preserve. Okay. So and they use also one organization, for example, from São Paulo, go to the periphery in order to teach a community. Okay.
Thanks.
Yes.
Question for Corinne. You mentioned at the start of the presentation that this was, you were kind of researching, it was fieldwork was a few years ago. It's not, the presentation is not on, the research is not on the current persecution, Trump administration around passports and genocide. But I wondered how you felt about how your work connects with this current status quo, because you can kind of see in this emergent disaster, people already starting to feel nostalgic for the old neoliberal regime that you quite rightly point out was also hugely problematic. So how do we kind of stop that kind of this sort of post-neoliberal authoritarianism turning into a kind of nostalgia for neoliberalism and kind of homo nationalism? And also, yes, kind of what comments do you have as someone thinking about this space so closely about how the industrial state is changing?
Of course, that's a really great question. I think that in the current moment, I think that the previous kind of rollout of Gender X taught us a lot about what sort of kind of apparatus is working on the limits. So for instance, the Zim case, it was decided based on the Administrative Procedure Act and not the actual kind of constitutional claims that Lambda Legal was making regarding like rights to identity and expression. So the government at that time was looking at it from how can we essentially allow this to happen without dealing with that constitutional question. And I think that avoiding going back to those constitutional questions, but actually working through these sort of procedural structural models is going to be the best way forward, because it gets rid of that neoliberal homo nationalist kind of nostalgia, but still allows for people to have the security of gender markers, correct gender markers, until we can get to a point where we can say to these governments, hey, you don't actually need this anymore. Right? You have all of this other identifying information that's on a passport that doesn't change. Right? And that's one of the reasons why they keep using gender markers, is because they say, well, this is something that doesn't change, and so therefore we can use it to consistently identify you across time and space. And something like, place of birth, that is also on a passport. That's a much more static marker. So we can, and a photograph, which is a current representation of a person, is a much better indicator of identity, right?
Thank you. More questions? Thoughts? All right, well, thank you all for coming. This has been a great panel with such important work from emerging scholars, so